A boy 15 on the road, nothing in his pocket, his hand to the sky, nowhere else to go. I've been on the road a lot this week and can't sleep tonight, and kind of really wondered if I needed to be on camera, but I can't sleep, and it finally happened. Being on the road so much the last, couple days here, driving around one end of Virginia to the other, ended up buying some books. And I didn't really get many. The guy wouldn't cut me a deal. He pretty much did me pretty good a couple times I've been there. But the nostalgia hit. A big thing of nostalgia. One of those things that people will tell you that's pretty powerful, and it was kind of a different nostalgia, man. Because I got this book. I'll tell you why in a little while. Getting ahead of myself. This book was stolen from me twice over the years, right? And I'll tell you why in a little bit and stuff. But I ended up finding this and I bought it. And it's a simple little book. Came out, I think this one actually came out probably around November, December of 1988. And, but I got it a few months after it had come out. Because I bought this book the same time I bought this book. Sandman, number 7. Elementals, number 3. I think it's volume 2. And when I bought these, I did a little digging when I got home. These two are the original I bought. But I think I bought these around May or June of 1989 off a rack. And the nostalgia that kind of hit is sort of it's memories. But so much time has gone by since that time that it's almost like I look back and I'm so disconnected from it. I'm such a different person. That it's like I'm looking back on someone that I saw in a movie or something. It's like a character in a movie or something. Like I can remember it, but it's more like that was somebody else I'm talking about. And when these books came out, I probably just turned 16, and the person I was from 15 to 16. That's probably one of the most important years of my life, because basically that was definitely the road where I actually started to become a man during that year. A lot happened during that year, personally and stuff. And this book, this little book, just reading this middle story inside of it, just kind of like brought all that back. And then I had those hours of driving, and it just, kind of a domino effect. So basically, this is Total Eclipse number 4. This was a 5-issue miniseries in this was prestige format back in the day, an actual graphic novel back in the day. And what it was is that it was Eclipse Comics' answer to Crisis on Infinite Earths. They even got Marv Wolfman to come in and write this. A couple years ago, I was at Heroes Con and I was in line to see George Perez, and Marv Wolfman had a table beside George. A couple tables down, and the line was actually so long that everybody would get a number, and you'd come back and see if your number was getting close so you could get in line. That many people wanted to see George Perez. And I looked down, and Marv Wolfman was there, and I'd already, I got him to sign my Crisis on Infinite Earths, and then I was going to get George Perez to sign him, which he did, all 12 issues. So while I'm standing there and nobody's really talking to Marv, everybody's just all excited about George, and they're watching him do sketches for people. He was doing them $30 for a headshot, which is a steal. But I sat there and I just kind of looked at Marv, and I was just sort of like, so why don't you tell me about Total Eclipse? And he jumped right on it. He said this was a mistake. This was just a bunch of characters that they were never meant to be together. Because this is... Eclipse was home of indie books. If you've watched my videos before and stuff, I always kind of mention how I kind of stayed away from the indies in the 80s, but they just really weren't around to get a hold of them. So it kind of worked out. And it was these feelings I had about when I read an indie book in the 80s, which I really would be curious for new readers to read them now, considering how big Image has gotten and all these books that came out in the 90s, and with Image, with what it is now, and Dark Horse and everything that was popping up, because you got to remember, Dark Horse had probably just been around for a few years, and you just knew they were doing Alien and Predator, and Concrete was kind of on the rise. But what happened was with indie books, you had underground books with Crumb and stuff like that. I'd read that stuff. They were bought in head shops and stuff, and shouldn't have been reading those as young as I was. And then Cerebus came out, and I didn't really hear about Cerebus until he came out in, Dave Sim did a few stories in Epic Illustrated for Marvel, and they were colored, they were in color instead of black and white, and they were stories about Cerebus when he was a kid and stuff. So that's how I kind of learned about Cerebus. Who knows? No comic shops, no internet, things like that. And then the black and white boom hit, and you started seeing these ads for like Love and Rockets and a few things. I might have read an issue here and there, but I could never put on my finger why they felt so different. Because indie books back then and the black and white explosion that hit, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was part of that stuff, and all, but they were so different, and I didn't have the words for them, and to me they weren't organic. They just weren't organic. It's like, I'm an indie book, so I'm going to like put some sex in there. I'm going to put some mature tones in there, and I'm going to go like ultra realistic violence and stuff that would pop up in there. But I didn't have the words, but it made for a very weird aura. And these indie books, they were still highly influenced by like Marvel and DC. Like Cerebus started out as a parody of a satire parody, whatever, of Conan the Barbarian, Barry Windsor Smith's, Roy Thomas's, Conan the Barbarian. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, they were highly influenced by Jack Kirby and Frank Miller. It was still there and stuff, right? But reading these as a kid and stuff, you kind of felt like you were doing something you weren't supposed to do. So here I am, like 15, and just like I said, from what I was from the time I turned 15 to the time I turned 16, so much had happened. I had the first love, which was different. It was the first love. It was summer, and basically, it was also around the same time that I just had enough. I'd already kind of would walk to places, like I'd go to the movies on Sunday or hang around the mall and stuff, but I'd always be home babysitting or doing something. And kind of perceptions being what they are, I heard I wasn't quite like this in school, but in school I was just kind of like a ghost. It was just sort of like, let's just get through this and can't wait to graduate and everything. And I had my I had friends that I would hang out with, like kind of like real tight, but I didn't really expand. And then I got picked on a lot because of being quiet, but it just kind of flowed right off me. To me, it was really odd how, I'm not saying I was detached, but I just couldn't take a lot of it serious. And then there's some things going on at home, and 15 was when I'd had enough. I don't know if I made a conscious decision, but it was like, you know what, I'm going to be out of here in a couple years, so maybe I'm going to get a life. So I would walk everywhere. And around that time that I decided to do that, I ended up like going to the mall a whole lot, and from the mall, people would be cruising the parking lot, just tons of cars on Saturday nights, Friday nights. Everybody'd come to the game room and go from there. Everybody, you find some people with a car, go hang out with them, go party a little bit, go do whatever and stuff. And I was sitting there one time, and I walked in, there's this big crowd around the Dragon Lairs game, if you remember that, Dragon's Lair, Don Bluth animation on a laser disc with a video game. And this guy was beating it, and there's this big crowd, and I remember I turned around and I saw this girl. No idea who she was. And she just kind of looked at me too, and I'm not saying I freaked, but I just kind of turned around and started walking. Ended up at my friend's house, maybe a day later, if not the same day. It might have been the same day, a couple hours later. Now, I told him, I was like, I saw this girl, and he just started smiling. He went, come with me. And we went next door, and he knocks on the door, and this old lady answers. It's a grandma, and it turns out the girl I saw was in for the summer, and this was her grandmother. Her family had come in. That lady had a son who was a Vietnam veteran, and when he was in Vietnam, he had met his wife. I can't really remember the story, but it was more like she was like in a village that there was like nothing left. So as a soldier, he married her, brought her to America, and they had these kids, and then raised the kids up until about first or second grade for the girl that I saw. And they had moved. He got a job in Saudi Arabia working for some big oil tycoon over there, some sheik with some oil. And he was coming in for the summer. And, first love, first heartbreak, because it was really odd. It was like, breakups and things like that. But it was because he had to go back to Saudi Arabia, and she went to a prep school in Austria. And it was one of the few times that I actually got, it was one of a handful of a few times where I kind of had like a tender moment with my mom because she saw it. So I probably didn't date anybody for like 13 months, not because of having my heart broke, but just because like, I ain't gonna get hurt like that again. It was really odd. Again, it was like all these things were going on, but by not dating and doing things like that, and growing up in that time, getting my learner's permit, a few other things happened. We don't want to get TMI and all that stuff. It kind of caused me to like put myself out there, work on myself, get to know people, kind of come out of my shell. Did a lot of traveling because my friends were starting to get their license and we were getting cars and stuff like that. And by not like really, going around chasing girls and making that a priority and stuff, it was more about having a good time and stuff. I grew up a whole lot in that time. Started taking less shit, and like I said, I was getting picked on in school, but this was about the time where all of a sudden I turned into like a little 110-pound ball of fury. Ended up getting like 3 or 4 fights in school. Didn't start a one of them, and some of them had been coming for a long time, but it didn't take a whole lot to get me to finish them. And as much as I don't condone fighting. I mean, it's really odd. I know fighting is wrong, but the reality is if you don't take up for yourself, it's like everybody's like, we got one this way. It makes it worse on you. All of a sudden you'll have all these bullies on you and stuff, trying to get a reputation off of you. Got into a couple fights, and all of a sudden it was just like it all went away. Didn't get picked on anymore or anything like that. It was just amazing. So, yeah, and it was all that time, and it all came back because of this book. And I remember buying these because like I was saying, it was like I just sort of had enough of what was going on at my house, and I was like, well, I want to get out. And we ended up going I remember going with 2 of my friends up to the Mercer Mall, which was like about an hour away back then, and they had Walden Books. This is probably May of 1988, if I'm remembering right. May of 89, maybe? Let me look at this. I've talked so much I got confused. Yeah. May of 89, so this came, So I got up there, and it was one of those things where I had been reading comics for a while, and this was a time where the most sophisticated thing you really had then was like, Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, where you got bits and pieces at it off a rack if you could find it. You'd grab some Frank Miller, Daredevil, or, Batman if you could find it over the years, but everything else was just kind of across the board. John Byrne's Superman was going on, just a year before this, you had Alan Moore's Killing Joke come out. Just a whole lot going on, reading wise. And all of a sudden I was like, well, I didn't have the words. That's the thing about getting older. I can look back now on it and know what I was feeling. I have the words now and stuff. But I was looking for something that was sort of like a slice of life. I wanted some of these books, I remember, to kind of like slow down and let's look at them as people. And I didn't have the words, but I was kind of getting unsatisfied with my reading. Now, that's usually the point where people go on and find other things to do. They kind of lose interest. But with me, I knew there was other stuff out there. There's indie books. I remember reading heavy metal. I knew there was more mature stuff. But it was really frustrating not to have the words for like what I was looking for. I couldn't just put my finger on it, So I ended up getting these books on the spinner rack. I remember it was like it was really odd when we got to that Mercer Mall. It was really electric. Maybe it was just being a teenager or something, right? But back then the mall was packed. Mercer Mall was twice the size and 3 times better than the Richlands Mall we had. That's why we went there. I remember looking at my friends saying, I'm going down here, and I remember walking through the crowd, and I swear you could actually feel like an electricity in the air. Like I said, maybe just being a teenager and stuff, there's a little bit of excitement. And walking into that Walden Books, and they had these plastic spinner racks and stuff where you had to watch what books you got because, people had gone through them and they'd bent the covers, and they had some magazines over here. And I remember not seeing anything I really wanted. So I was like, I'm going to try something different. So, I got this Elementals. And then, thanks to this ad that had been popping up in comics, you'll note when you see it, I decided to take a chance on something. I thought this was just a fantastic ad for a comic. I will show you Terror in a Handful of Dust, The Sandman, Neil Gaiman. It was just enough to make you curious and stuff. This was before Vertigo. You didn't know what was coming. So I ended up finding an issue, and I got this. These 2 are the actual issues. Now let me show you what they did when you got on the racks, because this was Walden Books. Okay, you see that UPC symbol right there where my finger is? This is an actual sticker, and where these had never been around before, and these books didn't hit the markets, the spinner racks and the drugstores and things like that. I kind of wanted to take it off, and I'll show you what happened, but after what happened in the other book, I didn't take it off, and now over the years, it's not going to show up, but that glue has sort of made a square that's kind of leaking into the comic and stuff. Elementals had the same thing. This is the actual book too. And you can see where I started trying to peel it off and it wouldn't come off right here at this corner. Okay. So, you know, I got this one because basically I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I mean. These things didn't feel marketable. You know, I didn't have the words back then, but it was the 80s, and you had the concept of corporations because of the hippies that stayed in school because they didn't want to go to the Vietnam War, and they ended up becoming the yuppies of the 80s, and everything got corporate and stuff. And this thing, these felt kind of counterculture at the time. You know, you just didn't know that. And man, the Elementals, when I got this book, it was really curious to see what was going on to walk in the middle of this story. Because the designs were actually just kind of weird. You didn't know what was going on with the characters. It's still heavily X-Men influenced, no doubt about it. And it was just really cool to read this, just how bizarre it was at the time. And then you had like a little slice of life and stuff. I mean, they had like angels popping up out of the blue. You saw these new ads in here for these books you never heard of that were out there. Probably the first time I heard of Grendel. I was like, what is that? Star Blazers, things like that. Heavy manga influence. Little do we know that in the 90s all this would come up. And then, like I said, you had the hyper-violence. Turns out that thing's a vampire, not an ape in a cloak. So you had things like that, and I was just sort of fascinated. I was like, wow. You know, you got that feeling you shouldn't have been reading this, you know. So, pretty tame stuff now. But this is Sandman number 7. And this is by Neil Gaiman. And what people kind of, unless you were there, you may not realize this, but when Neil Gaiman came on the scene, he did not become a superstar overnight. Okay, actually, when I read one of his first stories, which is in this, I'll get to this in a minute, kind of felt Alan Moore-ish, and then I'd seen that ad for the Sandman, so I get this book, and I think this is the one where it's yeah, it's I think it's 24 hours or something in a diner or something. What's going on? The art was outstanding, man, but the story was so different and kind of harsh, and it didn't flow like a superhero. You know, you got the Sandman going through here with his, you know, trench coat, and he's all black and Tim Burton like. You got the layouts like I've never seen before. It's just fascinating. You know, Dr. Destiny was so different in this. I knew the name Dr. Destiny. Turns out he was Justice League of America villain, but he's so different in this I didn't realize it. You know, so I mean, so much stuff in this happened that it was like it was so different than what was coming out at the time that, you know, it actually didn't feel that spectacular. Thus, I didn't really. I ended up reading this and rereading this a couple times, but it didn't really grab me at that time. Now, just remembering about Sandman here for a minute with Neil Gaiman stuff, the way I remember it, or at least around here and stuff, Sandman didn't really take off at all. And then word of mouth started getting around. They had issue 12 or 13 where he had a serial killer convention in the comics. And for some reason people started getting a little bit of a buzz about it. And then you didn't really hear too much more about Sandman until like around issue 19 when Charles Vess and Neil Gaiman did the story with, I'm going blank, with all the fairies and stuff. Oh my God, what a time to go blank. Anyway, their issue won a sci-fi award. And then all of a sudden everybody's talking about Sandman. And even issue number 8 that came out after this that had the first appearance of Death didn't really get talked about until the first trade paperback came out of Sandman. Okay, because they started with the Dollhouse. And I just can't help but wonder if they started with the second story in Sandman, the Doll's House, because of that serial killer convention that people were kind of talking about and getting a little buzz about. And they just happened to put in the first appearance of Death in there. And that's the way I remember it taking off. By the time it hit Seasons of the Mist, it was a bona fide, you know, cult hit and stuff. And Seasons of the Mist happened in the 20s. That book was less than 2 years old when that finally happened. So, and the way I remember it, it actually took about 2 years for that book to get big because of that. So I was remembering the fact that when Neil Gaiman came out, This book right here was stolen because right in the middle of the book we get an interlude, and in this interlude is Neil Gaiman's first Miracle Man story. And this was a treat to find because you got to remember I didn't have the words for how I was feeling about some of these books I was reading. But right off the bat we get an interlude in a Miracle Man story, and the character in here actually ends up looking like Miracle Man, but it's not him. But it's a man who has just lost his virginity, and he's smoking a cigarette, and he's been waiting 5 years to smoke that cigarette to have a cigarette after sex. And this is where it was one of the first indie stories that made me realize there was more that can be done. It wasn't gratuitous sex. It wasn't a gratuitous violence because we're an indie book. Let's throw it out there, man. This guy actually felt like a living, breathing character because of the way he reacted after having sex. And what happens is that he's set up, and now that he's lost his virginity, and he's had the sex, he's got the afterglow and stuff, he ends up talking. He ends up like opening up. After really good sex, sometimes you can't shut up when you should, So he sits here and he's telling the girl about the top 3 things that ever happened, the 3 most important things of his life that ever happened. And she was the third one, losing the virginity and having the sex. I think the second one was when he went to his aunt's house instead of going to London when he was a kid, and he met Miracle Man. And the first one was, oh my God. And the first one was when he actually met Miracle Man a few years later. And this was Neil Gaiman's first story. And he goes through there and you're introduced to this world of Miracle Man. Now, I'd probably seen an issue or 2 of Alan Moore's Miracle Man. Okay? That was published through Eclipse Comics. And then Neil Gaiman took over. And there was like this, I don't know if it was synchronicity or zeitgeist. But all of a sudden I get an issue of Sandman by Neil Gaiman. He pops up on this Miracle Man with Neil Gaiman. And we get flowing, and this was a time that change was about to come and going into the 90s. So I graduated in 1991, and it's kind of like the way I was growing up from 15 to 16, and the way that Neil Gaiman was kind of coming underneath, coming up from underneath the shadow of Alan Moore, because it did feel a little bit like he was writing like Alan Moore, just a touch. I reread this before the video and stuff, and it's all Neil Gaiman, But this perceptions just shows you how things have changed over the years and stuff, right? But this is just this is one of the first stories where it actually felt like a living, breathing human being, the way he was reacting, and it wasn't like sensationalized. And it kind of made you curious about what the hell is going on in Miracle Man now. It was already a hit. So, yeah, I hit a little bit of nostalgia, ended up thinking a little bit about the 80s and a little bit about growing up. And it just surprises me how I can really look back at that kid, and it really does not feel like me. It really feels, like I said at the beginning, somewhere towards the beginning of this video, it really feels like I'm looking at somebody else that I saw like on a movie or something, somebody I read about or something. And it'd be really cool to be able to like pop up, look at him and be like, man, you're going to be alright. It'd be kind of cool, Alright, well, couldn't sleep, felt like getting that off my chest. It was kind of cool to read a book, read a story from yesteryear, regain something. And I have no idea if this is worth any money, but hopefully it won't get stolen from me a third time, because this is Neil Gaiman's first Miracle Man story. Alright guys, later.